to Mr. Angus.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a very disturbing situation we're in. It's been 1 week since the Ethics Committee met to get reformed after Prime Minister Trudeau prorogued and shut down our investigation. We had a number of motions to get to in order to get on with business because we have an obligation to the Canadian people to finish the work that was begun on the WE scandal. And part of that was a simple motion to follow through on the documents that our committee agreed to ask for last July. So there should have been a very straightforward process of reintroducing the motion, then having the documents presented, and we could move on to many of the other things that all of us would like to talk about. Ms. Shanahan wants to talk about a COVID app. Well, I don't think it's actually under our purview. It's probably health. But rather than waste our time in an endless filibuster, she could just agree to turn the documents over and then could bring forward a motion. That's how Parliament is supposed to work. And we have an obligation to Canadians to get answers. I find this situation very frustrating because last week we attempted to work with the Liberals on the documents. The documents that it agreed to in July, we agreed to put very specific provisions to protect the privacy of individuals because the privacy of individuals is an important principle. We're not here to do naming and shaming. We're here to verify facts. And yet when we responded to the Liberals' demand for all manner of protections in this new motion, and we offered that, then the Liberals changed and wanted to fight about something else. The reality is we are going to get those documents because they're pertinent. So why are they pertinent? Well, because one of the unfortunate things that we've seen in the WE scandal is that we have been told time and time again, very conflicting stories about the Trudeau family's very close financial relationship with the Kielburger Group. And why does this matter? Well, the Liberals are trying to tell us that family does not include mother and brother, that somehow family is something, I don't know what kind of family that they envision, but in the Conflict of Interest Act, persons who are related to a public office holder by birth, marriage, common law partnership, adoption, or affinity are the public office holder's relatives for the purpose of the Act. The reason the issue of family is included in the Conflict of Interest Act is to ensure that family, whether knowingly or unknowingly, cannot be used as a conduit to exert influence on a public office holder. And when that public office holder is the Prime Minister of the nation, and when we're talking about a decision by key Liberal ministers to support what would have ended up being a $900 million plan to transfer money to this organization that has close financial ties, that requires a good deal of scrutiny, and it relies on answers being given very clearly. I would also suggest that under Section 5 of the Conflict of Interest Act, which I know Ms. Shanahan, all the relevant parts she seemed to be missing. Section 5 is key because it says every public office holder shall arrange his or her private affairs in a manner that will prevent the public office holder from being in a conflict of interest. So when she's talking about the private affairs of the family and how it's none of our business, well, it actually is our business because under the Conflict of Interest Act, it is the obligation of the public office holder to protect themselves from being found in a conflict of interest. And that's not something that's, kind of academic. This is what the Prime Minister of our nation was found guilty of in the very first findings by the Ethics Commissioner under the Trudeau Report 1, that he breached Section 5. And it wasn't over illegal lobbying by the Aga Khan. It wasn't about him agreeing to take a trip and then setting up meetings. It was about the connection between his family and his family's decision to go to the island that put the Prime Minister in a conflict of interest. So these documents should simply verify the latest story, the latest claim we have had from government and from the Kielburger Group about the payments that were made to the Trudeau family. We know that in the beginning, when questions were raised, the Prime Minister said he's never received any money from we. But we do know that the Prime Minister, after becoming the youth critic for the Liberal Party, carried on quite an extensive side business while being a parliamentarian doing public speaking. Was he paid by we? He said he never was. Well, those documents will simply verify that. If they verify that, we move on. But what if they don't? What if the Prime Minister was paid? That's a legitimate question and a very serious question. I can't for the life of me understand why the Liberals would be filibustering and trying to block access to documents if those documents conform to the Liberal line, which is the Prime Minister never received payments from the we group. Fine, show us the documents. In terms of his family, what struck us from the beginning was that we were told that Margaret Trudeau and Sacha Trudeau received no payment because they were volunteers. But we learned that that wasn't true, and that upwards or over $500,000 was transferred for their work. While we also learned the We Charity Board was told explicitly that the Trudeau family was not being paid. So what kind of deal is going down that a charity board asks a specific question whether the Prime Minister's close personal family are being paid and are being told, don't worry, they're not being paid when payments were made? This isn't to suggest that Mrs. Trudeau or Sacha did anything wrong. That's not the issue here. The issue is by creating this relationship that the Kielburgers developed with the Prime Minister, it put the Prime Minister in a very clear prima facie conflict of interest, that he needed to make sure that these payments, they were affecting him, because at the end of the day, he was the one who signed off on this deal with we. And we know from the documents that we received that the we group were using photos of his family to key ministries and key ministers who were going to sign off on this $900 million deal. That is an obvious conflict of interest. And yet, in the 5,000 pages of documents, no one from the Prime Minister's office raised a red flag and said, hey, you cannot use my family to promote your ability to get this $900 million contract. That cannot be done. Nobody said that. So if the $500 million or $500,000 in payments to the Trudeau family were, as the we group finally admitted, then the documents will simply verify that. What I find really surprising when we pushed the Kielburgers at finance about how these payments were made and why the Trudeau family were being paid and not other illustrious public speakers who were doing it for free, was that they said that these payments were made not for public speaking. Margaret Trudeau was not paid by we because of her extraordinary and I think very exceptional public presence as a mental health spokesperson. They didn't pay her for that. They paid her to work the after events, and those after events were the major corporate sponsorship events. So they were paying the Prime Minister's family to do work for them. That's an issue of conflict of interest. Those documents will either verify what those payments are or show us that there were other payments or other services rendered. We need to know that. If everything's as straight up as the Liberals say, they don't need to have us go all night. They don't need to derail our work at committee. They need to say, we will set a process up. We're all professionals here. We understand how these documents have to be treated. We will look at those documents, and if they verify what the Liberal government says and what Mr. Trudeau says about his financial relations with the Kielburger Group, then we can move on. But if those documents contradict it, well, then I think this scandal moves into a whole different turf. And I'm only raising that because I cannot understand this obstruction of a motion that had already passed committee in July, that we had support for, but yet was the only thing that stopped us from getting those reports was the prorogation, the forced shutdown of Parliament by the Prime Minister when we began to get close to getting answers. I have said at the last meeting, and I will repeat it again, we are trying to work with the other parties to move to a new committee that we can actually get all the issues from from finance, from government operations, from official languages to deal with this and deal with it in an issue, the larger issues of the pandemic spending. Issues of, for example, David McNaughton, a close insider friend of the Prime Minister who got all access pass right up to the Deputy Prime Minister and General Vance Chief of Staff while promoting, I think, a very dubious company. He got it because he's an inside Liberal. We need to look at the issue of Mr. Rob Silver and the fact that I've had many calls from businesses in my region who were barely hanging on because the rent subsidy program was such a debacle. And yet a company that was tied closely to the Prime Minister's inner circle was given the mandate. Was that done right? Or were the friends involved? We need answers. Canadians deserve answers because we are in the biggest medical and economic catastrophe in a century. We need to be able to show them that Parliament is focused on making sure that we're getting help, that we're getting help out the door in a timely manner, and the money is going to people who need it. Because I think at the end of the day, the biggest scandal in this deal to help the Kielburger Group was that the Prime Minister made a promise to university students who are suffering massive levels of student debt, massive levels of insecurity, that there would be $1 billion to help them. And not a dime of that money rolled out the door. As soon as the Kielburger Group couldn't get the money, the Prime Minister walked away on the university students of Canada. He left them high and dry. That is the fundamental scandal. So we need to report to Parliament. We need to get this report done. And so I'm saying, if it takes all night, if it takes all week, we will be here until the Liberals stop obstructing, stop interfering with work of Parliament, allow us to do our jobs as parliamentarians so we can get on with dealing with the many other issues that are facing Canadians as our COVID numbers are spiking again. There's more economic insecurity. We see cities like Ottawa, Montreal, Toronto being hit with possible more lockdown measures. We really need to get focused here. But to do that, we need to clear up this stench of corruption that's raised around this scandal. We need to get answers, and we need to be able to say to the Canadian people, your parliamentarians went to get you answers, and we got answers, and this is what the answers tell us. Whatever those answers are, good or bad, we have an obligation to get this, and that is why I'm calling on the Liberals to stop the obstruction, stop the interference, stop the game playing. You have an obligation to Parliament, just as we have. Let's get this job done. This is the role of our committee. We will continue to push until we get these documents. I will now cede the floor, Mr. Chair.